It was a crisp Saturday morning at the city animal shelter, the sun filtering through the windows and casting a soft glow over the rows of cages. The usual sounds filled the air, the soft whimpering of puppies, the low growls of bigger dogs, and the occasional bark that echoed through the hallway. Officer Ben Carter had been working at the shelter for over a year now, assigned to oversee the daily operations, making sure everything ran smoothly. He knew every dog here, well, almost every dog. But today, something caught his attention as he walked past the familiar pens. One cage at the far end of the hallway stood out. It was quieter than the others, as if the dog inside had given up on making noise. Ben paused and peered inside. There, sitting quietly in the corner, was a medium-sized golden retriever. Its fur was matted, its eyes dull and lifeless, but there was something about it that drew Ben in. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a sad dog at the shelter, but this one, there was a sadness that felt different. It was as if the dog had lost all hope. Ben knelt down to get a closer look, his hand resting lightly on the cage. The dog didn't react immediately, but after a few seconds, it slowly raised its head and locked eyes with Ben. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was a connection, however brief, that felt intense and real. The dog's gaze was full of unspoken words, a kind of quiet pleading for someone to notice it, to take it home. As Ben continued to watch, a small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Can I buy that dog, Daddy?" The words were soft, almost hesitant, but they carried the weight of a simple, innocent request. Ben turned around to find a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, standing behind him. Her wide eyes were locked on the golden retriever, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. The man beside her, presumably her father, looked down at her with a tender expression, but a hint of hesitation in his eyes. He was dressed in casual jeans and a jacket, his face showing signs of weariness, as though he had been carrying some burden for a while. He glanced at the dog and then back at his daughter, unsure of how to respond. Ben stood up and gave the little girl a soft smile. "You mean the dog in the pen?" he asked, trying to gauge her excitement. The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving the golden retriever. "Yes. Can we take him home? I promise I'll take care of him." Ben's heart sank a little. He had seen so many dogs go unadopted year after year. He had seen children coming with their parents, full of excitement and hope, only to leave empty-handed when they realized the dog they wanted wasn't ready to go home just yet. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about a family looking for a connection, something the dog and the little girl both seemed to need. The father shifted uncomfortably. "Sweetie," he said, kneeling beside her, "I don't think we can just buy him. A dog isn't like a toy. It's a big responsibility." But the little girl, her face full of innocence and determination, didn't seem to understand. She was too focused on the golden retriever in front of her. "Please, Daddy. He's lonely. I can make him happy. We can be a family." Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise of the shelter. For a moment, even Ben felt the weight of her words. She was right. The dog was lonely. The whole situation felt too much like fate. But the father still hesitated, unsure if adopting a dog was the right decision. Ben glanced back at the golden retriever. The dog was still sitting in the same spot, its eyes never leaving the girl, as though it understood everything she was saying. The connection between them was undeniable. Ben felt something stir inside him. Maybe this was the moment the dog had been waiting for. Maybe this was the family that could give him the love he so desperately needed. Ben cleared his throat and looked at the father. "It's not about buying him. It's about giving him a chance," he said quietly. The morning light streamed softly through the windows of the shelter, casting long shadows across the rows of empty cages. The usual sounds of dogs barking, whining, and playfully jumping against the metal bars were replaced by an eerie silence. Officer Ben Carter stood at the shelter's entrance, watching the last few visitors leave for the day. His eyes wandered over the rows of cages, glancing briefly at each animal. They all had their stories, their hopes and dreams, just waiting for someone to walk through the door and change their lives. Max, the golden retriever, had been with them for far too long. Ben had seen it all in the dog's eyes: exhaustion, fear, loneliness, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone came along who could change everything for him. Max had been brought to the shelter after his previous owners had abandoned him on the side of the road. It wasn't just a physical trauma he had endured. It was an emotional toll. The dog's inability to trust anyone had made it difficult for potential adopters to connect with him. He didn't jump up when people came to visit. He didn't wag his tail, even when the children smiled and reached out to pet him. Instead, Max sat in the corner of his cage, watching, waiting for a connection that never seemed to come. But today was different. Ben could feel in the air an unexplainable shift that seemed to hang like a promise. He had no idea why or how, but something about the little girl and her father had touched him. They had been standing in front of Max's cage for what seemed like an eternity. The father was hesitant, unsure of how to proceed, but the little girl, with her hopeful, innocent eyes, stood firm, asking the question that no one had expected to hear. "Can I buy that dog, Daddy?" she had asked softly, her voice a mixture of wonder and determination. Ben had turned around, surprised at the unexpected request. The girl's eyes were glued to the golden retriever, who sat motionless in his pen, watching her with a look of deep curiosity. Her words had been simple, but the intensity with which she asked them held more weight than she likely realized. Her father, a man who looked tired and worn, had kneeled beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder as if trying to gauge her seriousness. He sighed deeply, glancing at the dog before looking at his daughter. "Sweetie, you can't just buy a dog like that. He's not a toy. He's a living being that needs care and attention. And we don't know anything about him, do we?" The girl's face fell, but only for a moment. "But Daddy, he's lonely. I can make him happy. I promise I will take care of him. Please." Her words hit Ben harder than he expected. He watched the girl, her face full of earnestness and innocence. She had no idea what it meant to adopt a dog like Max. She didn't know about the patience, the training, the trust that had to be earned. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she spoke, that made Ben pause. Max hadn't had someone truly reach out to him in a long time. He had been waiting. Maybe this little girl was the answer. Maybe she could be the one to break through the walls Max had built around himself. Ben turned to the father, watching him struggle internally. "I know it's not easy," Ben said softly, "but I've seen dogs like Max find a home when the right person comes along. If you think you can give him the time and love he needs, it could work." The father hesitated, glancing from the little girl to the dog. His eyes were filled with doubt, but there was something in his gaze that softened. "Do you really think he'll be okay? Will he trust us?" Ben nodded, understanding the man's uncertainty. "It'll take time. Max has been through a lot, but I think he's ready. It's not going to be easy, but if you're willing to try, I believe he can come around. I've seen it happen before." The father looked down at his daughter, who was staring at him with wide, pleading eyes. He let out a long breath and smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "All right, we'll give it a try." Ben felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had seen so many dogs come and go, but something about this felt different. The bond that was starting to form between the girl and the dog was undeniable. Ben opened the cage, and for the first time in a long while, Max didn't retreat to the farthest corner of his pen. Instead, he took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air, his gaze locked on the little girl. She smiled, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out toward him. "Hello, Max," she whispered, her voice soft, as if speaking to a delicate creature. Max, after a moment's hesitation, walked forward and sniffed her hand, his body stiff but not withdrawn. The girl's smile widened, and her father stood by her side, watching the scene unfold. Ben stepped back, giving them space. He had seen dogs react in all sorts of ways, but this moment felt different. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that, but it was a start, and sometimes that's all it took. Max didn't trust easily, but he was standing there, allowing this little girl to touch him. There was something magical about the way he responded to her, something that Ben couldn't fully explain, but felt deeply. This wasn't just about adoption. This was a meeting of two souls who needed each other more than they realized. As the adoption papers were filled out and finalized, the little girl and her father prepared to leave. The girl gently clipped a new leash onto Max's collar, and the dog, though still cautious, walked beside her. Ben watched them walk out of the shelter, the door closing softly behind them. He felt a flicker of hope in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, Ben couldn't help but replay the events of the day. It had been a quiet moment, but it was one that had changed everything. Max had a family now. He had a chance. But Ben knew that the journey wasn't over. Max had a long way to go, and the girl, Emma, would need to learn how to care for a dog like him. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something special. The first few days at Emma's house were filled with excitement and a whirlwind of new experiences for Max. He had been brought into an unfamiliar world, one filled with strange smells, new sounds, and, most overwhelming of all, people who were determined to love him. But to Max, it felt like a lot to take in. He had spent so much of his life on his own, learning to survive without the care or attention he needed. His world had been confined to the shelter, and while it was far from ideal, it was familiar. Now, everything had changed. Max's new home was a cozy house on the outskirts of town. The front yard was large, with a well-maintained garden, and the backyard had a fence tall enough to keep Max from wandering off. It was a dream for a dog like him. Plenty of space, a family to call his own, and the possibility of a future filled with love. But Max wasn't sure he was ready to believe in that future just yet. Emma had been full of excitement from the moment she brought Max inside. She gave him a new collar, a soft bed to sleep on, and even a little toy, though Max showed little interest in it. He was too distracted by the newness of everything. The first night was difficult for him. He had always been a dog who found comfort in solitude, and now he was surrounded by the scent of people, the noise of a new home, and a little girl who seemed to want nothing more than to bond with him. But Max had trouble understanding that love. He had learned to protect his heart, to keep it guarded. And so, when Emma gently tried to curl up beside him on his new bed, he didn't respond with the excitement she had hoped for. He simply lay there, stiff, unsure, and a little frightened. Emma, though, was patient. She had always been patient, even with her father. She knew it would take time, but she was determined to make Max feel at home. Each day, she spent hours with him, sitting by his bed, talking to him softly, offering him food, and trying to help him adjust to his new life. She even started to read books aloud, sitting next to him with the pages open, hoping that her calm voice would soothe him. But every time she reached out to pet him, Max pulled away. Emma's father, Mark, was just as committed to making Max feel comfortable. He had always loved dogs and had owned one as a child, but he had never dealt with a dog like Max. He understood that Max's emotional scars ran deep, but he wasn't sure how to help him heal. Mark tried to bond with Max, giving him treats and throwing a ball in the backyard, but Max never seemed interested in playing. He only watched from a distance, his eyes full of suspicion. One evening, after a particularly difficult day when Max had refused to eat and had retreated to the farthest corner of the yard, Mark sat down next to Emma on the porch. "I don't know what to do, honey," he said quietly, watching Max through the window. "He's not like other dogs. He doesn't trust us." Emma looked at her father with concern in her eyes. "I think he's just scared, Daddy. He's been alone for so long. He doesn't know that we're here to help him, but we have to show him. We can't give up on him." Mark sighed and nodded. "I know. It's just hard when you want to help so badly, and it feels like the dog doesn't want anything to do with you." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, watching Max from a window. He was curled up on the floor of the kitchen, his eyes half closed, as if trying to shut out the world. It pained Emma to see him that way. She had always wanted a dog, but now that she had Max, she realized that healing wasn't as simple as she had thought. That night, after dinner, Emma went outside with Max again. This time, she was determined. She took her time sitting on the porch steps, watching the dog cautiously approach the backyard gate. He wasn't quite ready to play, but he had gotten a little closer to her, sniffing the air. She smiled, sitting still, not wanting to make any sudden movements that would frighten him away. "Max," she whispered softly, her voice full of warmth. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here and I'll always take care of you." Max hesitated. For a moment, Emma thought he might turn and retreat, but then he slowly walked toward her. She held her hand out, palm up, in a gesture of trust. He stopped a few inches away from her, his nose twitching unsure. And then, to Emma's surprise, Max gently placed his head in her hand. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was everything. Emma's heart leaped with joy, and she slowly began petting him, her fingers working through his scruffy coat. Max didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply allowed her to touch him, to show him that not all humans would hurt him. Tears filled Emma's eyes as she whispered, "See, Max? I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to be your friend." Over the next few days, Max began to settle into his new life, though it was still a slow process. He started eating more regularly and slowly began to interact with Emma and Mark. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when he would hide in the corner of the yard, retreating from the world, but those moments became less frequent. As time went on, Max began to trust Emma more. She would take him on walks around the neighborhood, and he would walk beside her, cautiously at first, but with growing confidence. Max was still hesitant around Mark, but he was beginning to trust him as well. Mark took Max to the park one afternoon, where he threw a tennis ball, hoping that Max would chase it. At first, Max didn't show much interest. But then, after a few throws, something changed. Max sprinted after the ball, running with newfound energy, and when he brought it back to Mark, his tail wagged the first time. The small victories were the ones that meant the most. Each day, Max's world expanded a little more. He began to learn that he didn't have to be afraid. He could trust the people around him. The scars of his past were deep, but with each step, they began to heal. One afternoon, as Max and Emma sat on the porch, Max resting his head on her lap, Emma turned to her father, who was sitting nearby, reading a book. "Daddy," she said softly, "I think he's finally starting to believe that we're not going to leave him. I think he knows he's home." Mark looked up from his book, his eyes meeting Emma's. He smiled warmly, his heart swelling with pride. "I think you're right, honey," he said. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma nodded. "It's been hard, but I think it's worth it. Max is worth it." Max lifted his head, looking at the two of them, his eyes soft and full of gratitude. For the first time, he wasn't just a dog in a shelter. He wasn't just an abandoned animal. He was a part of family, and he had found a place where he could truly belong. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the dynamics in the house began to shift. Max's presence had become a quiet comfort in the home, but his past still cast a shadow over him. Though he was growing more attached to Emma and Mark, there were moments when the past would resurface, when Max would retreat into himself, hiding in corners or under furniture, seeking solace in solitude. Emma, ever patient, understood these moments. She had learned not to rush him, to let him come to her in his own time. She would sit quietly near him, reading a book or talking softly, letting Max know she was there without demanding anything from him. Mark, too, began to understand the complexities of their new family member. He spent evenings sitting on the porch, simply talking to Max, telling him stories about his own childhood dog, recounting memories of simpler times, hoping that Max could somehow find comfort in the sound of his voice. The bond between the three of them grew stronger each day, and Max, despite his initial hesitation, began to show signs of his own transformation. It was as if the dog had finally realized that his new family was here to stay, that they were not like the people who had abandoned him. It was clear now that Max had begun to trust them, though the process was slow and sometimes painful. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the backyard, Emma and Max sat together in the grass. Max had his head resting on her lap, his eyes half closed as he enjoyed the soft strokes of her hand against his fur. It was a peaceful moment, one that spoke volumes about how far they had come since that first tentative meeting at the shelter. Emma looked down at him, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I think you're finally starting to believe that we're not going anywhere," she whispered. "You're safe now, Max. You don't have to be scared anymore." Max's tail gave a slight wag, and Emma's heart swelled. She knew that every small gesture from Max was a victory. She knew that, in his own way, he was learning to love again. It was a beautiful, quiet moment between them. Two souls healing together, learning how to trust, how to love, and how to be a family. But even in the calmest of moments, there were still reminders of Max's past that crept into their lives. One evening, just a week later, The family faced an unexpected challenge that tested their newfound bond. It was around dinner time when the first sign of trouble appeared. Max had been acting a little more skittish than usual, darting to corners of the house whenever loud noises startled him. Mark had just finished cooking dinner, and Emma was setting the table when Max suddenly bolted from the kitchen. His ears flattened against his head, his body tense. It was a reaction they had come to expect when something startled him, but this time it was different. He didn't just hide in a corner. He ran straight for the back door. "Max, come back," Emma called, but the dog was already halfway to the door, his movements frantic. Her heart raced as she followed him, her father right behind her. "Max!" Mark shouted, but the dog didn't respond. The door swung open, and Max darted into the backyard, his tail tucked between his legs as he ran. The father and daughter stood in the doorway, confused and concerned. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice tense. Emma didn't have an answer. She knew Max had his moments of fear, but this seemed different. It was as if something had triggered a deep-rooted terror in him. Something more than just the usual unease he experienced around loud noises or sudden movements. Emma's heart sank as she watched Max disappear into the shadows of the yard. "I'll go after him," Mark said, already moving toward the door. "Stay here, Emma. I'll get him." Emma nodded, but her stomach twisted with anxiety. She had seen Max run before, but he had never been this panicked. There had to be something more, something that had caused this kind of reaction. Mark quickly followed Max's trail into the backyard, calling out for him. "Max! Hey, buddy, it's okay. Come back, boy." His voice was calm, but the urgency in his tone betrayed his concern. He walked through the grass, scanning the yard for any sign of Max. The dog was nowhere to be seen, and the silence was heavy. After a few minutes of searching, Mark spotted him, crouched near the far side of the yard, trembling. Max's body was low to ground, his ears flat, his eyes wide with fear. Mark took a few tentative steps forward, trying not to startle him. He knelt down slowly, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "It's okay, Max," Mark said softly, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you." Max didn't respond at first. He just stared at Mark with those wide, panicked eyes. The fear was palpable, and for a moment, Mark wasn't sure if he could reach him. But then, slowly, Max's body began to relax, his tail giving a hesitant wag. Mark reached out slowly, his hand trembling just slightly, and Max took a step forward, sniffing his fingers cautiously. "It's okay, buddy," Mark whispered again, his voice a little more confident now. "Come on, let's go inside." Max, still cautious but no longer frozen in fear, allowed Mark to gently coax him back into the house. As they walked together, Mark noticed how Max kept looking up at him, as if seeking reassurance with every step. Emma was waiting in the doorway, her face etched with worry. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, but he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "He will be. He's just scared." Something set him off. Emma knelt down beside Max, who was now sitting in front of the door, his body still shaking slightly. "Max," she whispered. "What happened?" "You're safe. I'm here. I promise I'll never let anything happen to you." Max looked at her, his eyes softening as he felt her touch. Slowly, he lowered his head onto her lap, resting there as she stroked his fur, trying to calm him. It was clear that Max had been triggered by something, though Emma and Mark still weren't sure what. Maybe it was a sound from the street, or something in the environment that reminded him of his past. "I don't know what happened," Mark said, shaking his head. "But we need to be careful with him. He's still dealing with a lot of fear, a lot of old wounds." Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she continued to pet Max, feeling his body slowly relax under her touch. "I know," she said softly, "but we'll help him. We won't give up on him." The days that followed were a mixture of progress and setbacks. Max's episodes of fear became less frequent, but they still happened. Every time he would retreat or show signs of anxiety, Emma and Mark would respond with calm patience, always reminding him that he was safe, that they were there for him. One afternoon, while they were out on a walk together, Max had another moment of fear when a loud car backfired. He immediately froze, ears flattened, tail between his legs, and began to retreat. Emma and Mark were quick to react, immediately sitting down on the sidewalk with him. Emma wrapped her arms around Max, speaking softly to him. "Max, it's okay. We're here. We're not going anywhere. You're safe." Gradually, Max's breathing slowed, and he allowed Emma to guide him forward once again. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Max was learning that not all sound were threats, that not every movement required him to hide. He was beginning to trust again, one step at a time. Over the course of several months, Max continued to improve, though it was clear that his journey to full healing would take time. He became more playful, more confident, and began to bond deeply with Emma and Mark. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was happening. Slowly, day by day, Max learned to trust, and in doing so, he began to live again. And as the seasons changed and the sun set on the horizon, Max, the once-forgotten dog, found a home filled with love, acceptance, and the promise of a future free from the scars of his past. As the days passed, the transformation in Max was undeniable. The once cautious, withdrawn dog was now beginning to show signs of the joyful, trusting companion he had always been deep down. The family had given him what he needed most: time, patience, and love. But most of all, they gave him the one thing he had been waiting for: a chance to trust again. Max was no longer the dog that would retreat to the corner of the yard at the slightest noise. He now followed Emma and Mark with an eagerness that filled their hearts with joy. He would wag his tail when they came home, greet them at the door, and happily run to the backyard when they called his name. And when Emma sat down to read, Max would curl up beside her, resting his head in her lap as she ran her fingers through his fur. It wasn't always perfect. There were still moments when something would trigger a flash of fear in Max, when a loud noise would send him cowering under the bed, or when the sight of a man in a hat would remind him of his past trauma. But with each passing day, those moments became fewer and farther between. Max was learning that not all people were like the ones who had abandoned him. Not all sound were a threat. And, most importantly, not all love came with an expiration date. One sunny afternoon, Emma and Max were sitting in the backyard, enjoying the warmth of the sun on their faces. Max had become more playful, and Emma loved to watch him chase after sticks she threw into the yard. It had taken time, but the bond between them had grown stronger than ever. She could see it in his eyes, the trust, the affection, and the quiet joy that now radiated from him. For so long, Max had been guarded, but now he was beginning to show his true self. A dog with a heart full of love, a dog who had learned to live again. As Max ran back to her, his tail wagging, Emma smiled and reached down to pet him. "Good boy," she whispered softly. "You're doing so well, Max. You're finally home." It was then that Mark stepped outside, carrying a cup of coffee in one hand. He had been watching them from the window, unable to hide the smile on his face as he saw how far Max had come. It had been a long road for all of them, but it had been worth it. "You know," Mark said, his voice filled with quiet pride, "I never thought I'd see the day when Max would be running around like that." Emma glanced up at her father, her eyes bright. "I knew he could do it, Daddy. I just knew it." Mark joined them in the yard, sitting down next to Emma. Max trotted over to him and sat at his feet, looking up at him with those soft, soulful eyes. Mark reached down to scratch behind his ears, and Max leaned into the touch, his body relaxing. "Seems like he's finally found his place, huh?" Mark said, his voice full of emotion. "And it's with us." Emma nodded, her heart full. "I think he's finally figured out that we're not going anywhere. I think he knows he's loved." Mark smiled and looked at the two of them, his daughter, so full of hope, and the dog who had come to be so much more than a pet. He was family now. "You've done something incredible, Emma. I don't think you even realize what an impact you've had on him." Emma looked at Max, who was now sitting contentedly by her side, his eyes soft and trusting. "We've both helped each other, Daddy. He needed us, and we needed him. It's not just about giving him a home. It's about giving him a family." Mark's heart swelled with pride as he watched them. He had been hesitant at first, unsure if adopting Max was the right choice. But now, looking at the joy in Emma's eyes and the peacefulness in Max's expression, he knew they had made the right decision. Max had come into their lives like a missing puzzle piece, filling the gaps they didn't even know were there. And Emma, in her innocence and determination, had given him the love and patience he needed to heal. The past few months had not been easy, but they had been worth it. Max had struggled to overcome his past, and they had struggled alongside him, learning about the true meaning of patience and unconditional love. But now, they were a family, Max, Emma, and Mark, together, stronger than ever. It was a quiet evening when the phone call came. Emma had just finished dinner and was in the living room, sitting on the floor with Max, when Mark answered the phone. Emma didn't think much of it at first. She had seen her father take work calls before, but there was something about this one that made her stop what she was doing. Mark's voice was calm but serious as he listened intently to the person on the other end of the line. He glanced over at Emma and then motioned for her to come over. "It's for you," he said, handing her the phone. "Who is it?" Emma asked, confused. Mark smiled softly, though his eyes were filled with emotion. "Just take the call." Emma took the phone. Her curiosity piqued. "Hello," she said tentatively. "Emma?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but there was something in the tone that made Emma's heart race. "Hi, Emma. This is Carla from the shelter. I just want to check in and see how Max is doing." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "Carla, wow, it's been a while. Max is doing great. He's really starting to adjust. He's happy, and he's playing more every day. He's finally settling in." Carla's voice was warm, and Emma could hear the smile in her words. "I'm so glad to hear that, Emma. I remember when you first brought him in, how unsure he was, how withdrawn he seemed. And now, it sounds like he's found his place with you. That makes me so happy." Emma's voice softened. "Yeah, he's found a home. A real one. He's part of our family now." Carla paused for a moment before speaking again. "Emma, there's something I wanted to ask you. We've had some of Max's previous records come through the system again. It's nothing bad, but I thought you might want to know. His previous owners. Well, they've been trying to find out where he went. They've reached out to us. But Emma, I want you to know that Max is yours now. His past is behind him. He's with you, and nothing can change that." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She glanced over at Mark, who was watching her with concern. "They want him back?" she asked quietly. Carla's voice was reassuring. "No, Emma, they don't have a claim on him anymore. You've given him the love and stability he needs. And that's what matters. Max is home with you." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she held the phone to her ear. She glanced down at Max, who was lying peacefully beside her, his head resting on her lap. He looked up at her with trusting eyes, and in that moment Emma knew, without a doubt, that he was hers forever. "Thank you, Carla," Emma whispered. "I just wanted to hear that. Max is home. He's where he belongs." The following weeks were a blur of happiness, as the bond between Emma, Max, and Mark grew even stronger. They celebrated their first Christmas together, with Max lying contentedly beside the tree as Emma and Mark exchanged gifts. Max had never been more relaxed, more at peace. He had finally found his place, a place where he was loved and wanted. Emma and Mark had both learned so much from Max. They had learned the true meaning of patience, of healing, and of never giving up. Max had come into their lives as a broken dog, scarred by his past, but he had found his way back to happiness. He had learned to trust again, and in doing so, he had given Emma and Mark the greatest gift of all, the gift of unconditional love. Max's journey wasn't over. It would continue, day by day, as he discovered what it meant to be truly loved, to be part of family. And Emma, with her heart full of hope and determination, would be there every step of the way, guiding him, loving him, and showing him that home wasn't just a place. It was where your heart belonged. And for Max, he had finally found his home.